Hello and welcome to this installment of The Independent Pianist. I'm your host, Cole Anderson. Today I'm covering another of the Prelude and Fugues from J.S. Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, the second from the first book in C minor. It occurred to me a few weeks ago when I uploaded the first Prelude and Fugue in C major that I gave a long discussion on performing style and the possibilities regarding playing Bach on the piano, but after recording that whole commentary, I realized I didn't address a very central topic relating to these pieces, which is, of course, temperament. It's in the title. It's called the Well-Tempered Clavier, or the Well-Tempered Keyboard. This is not terminology that is widely understood, even in musical circles, and I hadn't previously gone into it much myself either. I kind of knew about it, but I hadn't really explored the different temperaments and what that means. But after the last video, I got a comment from a friend of mine, the pianist Joseph Yungen, who's really interested in the tuning systems that were prevalent in centuries before the 20th, and which are making a kind of a comeback now. Joseph, by the way, he's a really great pianist. I do recommend taking a look at some of his recordings. He has some videos up, I think, that you can look at. I'll link to some things in the description box as well, so you can also get to know him a little bit as well. But talking about temperament, what does temperament actually mean? To understand the concept of temperament in relation to music, you have to understand the difficulty inherent in tuning with regards to certain intervals of the naturally occurring harmonic overtone series. So the overtone series, of course, above any note that is sounded, there's going to be a series of faintly audible overtones above that note that you'll hear if you're listening very carefully. And the intervals of the overtone series are really the foundation of the whole tonal system. So for example, in the overtone series there are the interval of the perfect fifth, the perfect octave, and the major third, which together form a major triad, which is a very basic element, of course, in Western classical music. So for example, the interval of a perfect fifth, as it occurs naturally as an overtone, is actually slightly wider than the one that you will hear in modern systems of piano tuning. It's very subtle. I mean, I don't think you'd even hear the difference necessarily unless you have an extremely good ear. All that this means is that if you were to stack 12 fifths, one on top of the other, starting from C, for example, C to G, and eventually coming back around to F and C, that final C would not be the same as your starting C if you were actually tuning according to the overtone series. It would actually end up being a quarter of a half step sharper. So that's pretty noticeable, right? Likewise, if you stack three major thirds one on top of the other, for example, something like C, E, G sharp, C, if you use the pure third from the overtone scale, that final C will be slightly flat compared to the first C. And that's because a pure third, as found on the overtone series, is slightly narrower than what you'll hear on a modern tuned piano. I mean, this is quite a subtle difference. I'm not sure if you would necessarily notice out of context that the third is so different. And don't be concerned if you don't really notice the difference. In isolated cases, it's not so obvious to hear these differences. But to make it more obvious, I decided to include two complete performances of this Prelude and Fugue in C minor. One is in standard equal temperament. That's how most pianos are tuned nowadays. And one is in a well-tempered system. So there is the problem that musicians have faced with any system that divides the octave into 12 tones, like our Western classical music system. To maintain a ratio of 2 to 1 for all the octaves, so that all the octaves sound the same, it's necessary to temper certain intervals, or basically just make them slightly out of tune. The universally used modern system, Equal Temperament, takes a simple and practical approach. Simply divide the octave up into 12 exactly equal half steps. This results in all fifths being slightly narrow and all major thirds being significantly wider than their forms on the overtone series. So basically in the modern system, every interval is out of tune very slightly compared to their natural versions, but all by the same amount, so it's very consistent. It's not actually widely known. This system of tuning was not really a modern invention either. It became popular in the 20th century, but it was certainly known to musicians of Bach's day, and indeed before him as well. It just wasn't considered to be a good solution at that time. The reason being the general out-of-tuneness of what was considered to be the most euphonious and pleasing of intervals, the major third, the building block of tonality. In fact, even to this day, though, equal temperament of the piano does cause problems when you're collaborating with string players, for example, who have to adjust their intonation to match this slight out-of-tuneness of the piano in certain passages. In generations previous to Bach and his contemporaries, a system known as mean tone temperament was widely used, and this system enabled a maximum number of perfectly in tune thirds in the most used keys. But the drawback was that if you wanted to try to play in an unusual key or to modulate, an extreme out-of-tuneness would result. Well, sometimes they would try to get around this by actually having a split key for certain black key notes so that you could get both a G sharp and an A flat or an E flat or a D sharp, for example. But this was a little bit awkward. The more difficult the music became, of course, the more awkward this would be to actually play. And it's more of a curiosity. A more widespread solution was Well-Temperament. And Well-Temperament, in effect, represents a kind of middle ground between the two extremes of mean tone temperament, which has a maximum number of in-tune thirds, and Equal Temperament, where all the thirds are out of tune. In Well-Temperament, the thirds are not tuned to be exactly true, but as many of them as possible are closer to being true major thirds than in Equal Temperament, and some of the fifths also are exactly pure as well. This is made possible by having half steps that are not exactly the same, and not all of the other intervals are exactly consistent either. This very inconsistency lends the sound of this tuning a very human-like kind of sound. So sometimes a major chord, like a C major chord for example, will sound more relaxed and kind of harmonious, whereas in other keys, like F sharp major, it'll have a somewhat buzzier, more active kind of sound. This gives each tonality a unique kind of quality all of its own. This kind of tuning eventually fell out of practice in the 20th century, however, with greater use of chromatic harmony, whole tone scales, and atonality. The more impersonal Equal Temperament could fit a more wide range of musical use. But this kind of temperament can really open amazing possibilities in older music in particular, and even in more recent music of basically a tonal sound. There's many different possible Well-Temperaments, and Bach apparently had his own way of tuning his own instruments. Unfortunately, we don't know what that method was. So at Joseph's recommendation, I experimented with several different tunings, but my favorite ended up being a slightly modified version of Thomas Young's 1799 Well-Temperament. It was quite fascinating to discover as well, by the way, that this Thomas Young, who originated this tuning, was a polymath and was the originator of the famous double-slit experiment in physics, which helped to establish the wave theory of light. I hadn't realized before that he also had proposed this method of well-tempered tuning. Quite fascinating. So I hope this makes this slightly arcane area of the piano a little more clear. It's a highly interesting field that I intend to look into more as time goes on. So anyway, at any rate, please enjoy the performances, and do let me know what you think about the tunings. If you notice a difference between them, if you prefer one to the other, just leave a comment and let me know. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts.